On the 19th of October 1959, a Boeing 707 aircraft set to be delivered to Boeing International Airways departed the Boeing field in Seattle, Washington for a routine customer guarantee and acceptance training flight. On board the plane were 8 men aiming to put on a show for the would-be customers. Little did they know that it was going to be a horror spectacle, as within a couple of hours the aircraft would be tumbling towards the ground with its engines having fallen off. What happened next was shocking. It was a Monday afternoon on the 19th of October 1959 when a selected Boeing 707 was set to complete a routine demonstration and acceptance training flight ahead of its delivery to Boeing International Airways. That fateful day, the mission was to get pilots from the airline to become acquainted with the aircraft that they would soon be flying regularly. The estimated flying time for the mission was expected to be around 4 hours and 15 minutes. The 707 aircraft being used for this demonstration was a 4-month-old 707220 model powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney JT4A engines and sporting a registration number N7071. At the point of the incident, the aircraft had logged only 173 total airtime hours. The Boeing 707, launched a couple of years earlier in 1957, was the world's first commercial long-haul narrow-body jet. Its sales, however, had not been hitting expected levels at the time. Boeing usually had to invite big players in the aviation industry to Lake Washington in order to showcase their first commercial airliner in test flights in order to influence their decision. The 8-man crew aboard the aircraft included Boeing test pilot 32-year-old Russell Baum, who had just over 5,000 hours of experience flying on different aircraft. With him were Boeing captains and 49-year-old John Burke, who had over 2,500 hours of flight experience. It was, however, the first time flying the Boeing 707. With them was 43-year-old Frank Stanley Jr., who had almost 2,500 flight hours himself. With them in the cockpit was Boeing flight engineer George Hagen. Following pre-flight checks, takeoff clearance was given, and at 2:51 p.m. the aircraft took off from the Boeing field above North Snohomish County, Washington for its demonstration flight. Those on board didn't know at the time that this demonstration would go totally wrong. After takeoff, test pilot Baum demonstrated several maneuvers at the cruising altitude of 12,000 feet, which were then replicated by Burke. Baum then initiated a series of Dutch rolls at cruising speed in clean configuration. This means that the flaps were retracted to demonstrate the proper method for the recovery of the aircraft. A Dutch roll is continuous back and forth, or yawing motion of the aircraft, which could be caused by air turbulence or the prevalence of increased force or drag on one side of the aircraft. 2 things which aren't uncommon in aviation. The first series of Dutch rolls were initiated by test pilot Baum, who was positioned in the right-hand seat as he slowed the aircraft to 155 knots or 179 miles per hour and lowered the flap 40 degrees while Boeing Captain Burke made a series of recoveries. Once this was done, Burke moved to the right-hand seat, swapping positions with Baum. This allowed Baum to perform the same maneuvers but in the opposite direction, while Burke managed the recoveries. During the first set of maneuvers, Baum had allowed the 707 to bank over 25 degrees on its axis, which was more than the maximum limit imposed by Boeing. As a result, he was warned by fellow test pilot Alsop about the restrictions. However, despite the warnings, Baum decided to go harder with his second Dutch roll maneuver, which resulted in the aircraft banking at an angle of almost 60 degrees, almost 40 degrees more than the limit. As the angle was too steep and the plane began to oscillate wildly from left to right at steep angles, Captain Burke decided that it was best to let the aircraft complete some more oscillations and stabilize a bit before he begins to recover the aircraft. However, due to his inexperience with the 707, he was unfamiliar with the roll recovery process and wildly overcorrected during the plane's recovery. This caused the aircraft to row rightwards past the 90 degrees angle, almost becoming perpendicular to the ground, before yawing back a bit leftwards and entering into something of a downward spiral. Test pilot Baum quickly took control of the aircraft and applied full left aileron control and was able to restore the aircraft to level flight as he halted its dive. For a moment, the pilots and passengers breathed a sigh of relief. However, what they had just witnessed was merely a light scare because the real danger had only just begun. In the cockpit, the pilots suddenly began receiving indications of a complete loss of thrust in 3 of the aircraft's engines, as well as a loss of electrical power. Just behind them, in the area before the cabin, the passengers went to look out through the windows in the cabin for potential damages, only to notice something harrowing. 3 of the aircraft's engines, along with their pylons, had been ripped off its wings during the violent spiral. The only remaining engine was the number 3 engine. To add to the passengers' horror, some parts of the wings, which the pylons had been attached to, were now engulfed by flames with jet fuel spilling out through the openings. FAA Inspector Hubener quickly informed the pilots of the difficult situation. Very quickly, everyone on board the aircraft knew they were in serious danger. The passengers, including flight and maintenance engineer, second test pilot, and FAA inspector, all moved towards the seats at the aircraft's tail section and assumed ditching positions as they braced up for a potential wheels-up emergency landing. To add insult to injury, Baum was neither able to reach the Payne Air Force Base in Everett, nor the airport in Arlington. With no one to contact, he made the decision to land in a large open pasture just a mile west of a farming community called Oso. Baum then steered the aircraft southeast over Deer Creek before it made gradual right turn to a heading of 200 degrees. But the crash landing was beginning to look improbable, as Baum was unable to keep the wings of the aircraft level due to the torque from its only operational engine pulling the aircraft to one side. To try and get the aircraft level, Baum decided to shut down the only remaining engine and perform a dead stick approach. Since the wings were still intact at this point, there was a decent chance for the pilots to steer the aircraft into the woods below. For the first few thousand feet, this procedure worked and the aircraft glided towards the ground below. But then, the inevitable happened. Within a couple thousand feet of the pasture, the plane struck the top of some tall trees. This impact caused the plane to lose control and slam onto the bank of the Stillaguamish River, 800 meters short of the intended landing field. The jet fuel spilling out from the wings ignited on contact, completely destroying the forward section of the fuselage in the process as the aircraft skidded over several hundred meters. The tail section had also broken away during the impact and landed in the middle of the river. Quite astoundingly, it had remained almost fully intact. At the rear end of the aircraft were the 4 relieved passengers who had braced themselves for impact. Somehow they had survived with only minor injuries. They then crawled out of the wreckage and into the river where they were helped onto land by some onlookers. The rest of the people on the other forward section of the aircraft, however, were not so lucky. The fire from the impact had engulfed the cockpit, where 4 of the pilots had remained. They stood no chance and died almost immediately. The survivors were quickly taken to the Arlington General Hospital to receive care, while a recovery effort commenced for the bodies of the victims, as well as other important parts of the aircraft for investigations. By nighttime, all 4 bodies had been found. 3 of them remained in the cockpit while the last one was found and pulled from the river. The next day, one of the engines was found somewhere in the woods, about a mile from the crash site, and another found a mile further away. It took about a week before the 3rd engine was found, this time by a helicopter which had been patrolling the area. So what was it that went wrong with the engines that caused them to violently rip off during the Dutch roll maneuver? The investigations quickly began to answer these questions. All 3 engines had been found with major portions of their pylons still attached, despite the violent manner with which they were ripped off. Added to that was the fact that none of the engines had shown evidence of a malfunction or fire occurring before they came into contact with the ground. The flight data recorder was recovered, but as it was a test flight, it had not been activated. This meant that the only idea investigators could gain concerning the state of the aircraft before the crash would have to come from the surviving passengers, as well as ground witnesses. It took over half a year, but the NTSB, which was then known as the Civil Aeronautics Board, or CRB, finally released a comprehensive accident report on the incident in June 1960. Its report claimed that the ripping off of 3 engines had been caused by the structural failures of the affected pylons, which had been as a result of the improper recovery attempt of the Dutch roll maneuver. It appeared the severity of the oscillations to which the aircraft was subjected had developed loads greater than the design strength of the nacelle pylon structure. The report also deduced that no advantage could be gained by conducting the maneuvers at such extreme angles. It did, however, also mention that since the number 3 engine was functional, the flaps may have been raised to 28 degrees, so that full outboard aileron effectiveness would be available during the landing. According to the report, in such a configuration, the aircraft may have been able to fly long enough to reach a suitable airport to conduct a crash landing. But as there was an intense fire emanating from the ruptured fuel line, this threatened to engulf the left wing. Thus, landing immediately was more of a necessity than a choice, and there was little time to think otherwise. Interestingly, that crash was also caused by a rolling maneuver, which was performed at too low of an altitude. Regardless, however, the results of the crash would permeate the future of test flights. As a result of the incident, the CAB recommended that the Boeing pilot training syllabus be revised to emphasize the limitations on executing a Dutch roll, and also ensure whichever pilot performs this maneuver is experienced enough to handle it. Boeing test pilot Russell Baum, whose wild banking of the aircraft led to the crash, had sadly not made it. Neither did flight analyst George Hagan, nor Braniff pilots John Burke and Frank Staley. They had all lost their lives unnecessarily in only the second ever accident of a Boeing 707. Test pilot Baum may have been overly eager to impress and overdid his maneuver despite initial warnings. He failed to take consideration of the other 7 individuals with him on the plane. 4 lives were avoidably lost due to the actions of a carefree pilot. But what are your thoughts on the crash of the aircraft? Please let us know in the comments below.